When a faded photograph arrives at the St. Mary Mead post office, addressed only with the words, "To whom it may concern," it stirs memories best left buried. But when the unsmiling woman from the picture is seen walking through the village lanes days later, Miss Marple knows that something long forgotten has come home. Where are you joining us from today? What time is it for you now? How has your day been so far? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you, and it helps others discover these mysteries too. Now, find something warm to sip, get comfortable, and let's begin. It was the sort of morning in St. Mary Mead that promised little in the way of excitement. Damp with the smell of late autumn soil and the faint rustle of hedgerow sparrows preparing for winter. Mrs. Hartnell, the postmistress, had just unlocked the heavy brass drawer behind the counter when she paused, her hand tightening on an envelope that bore neither stamp nor return address. It was cream-colored, old-fashioned, and sealed with an elegant curl of wax, oddly formal in an age of telephone bills and postcard greetings. Later that morning, as was often her custom, Miss Marple stopped by the post office for her weekly copy of the Times Literary Supplement and to post a modest parcel to her niece in Cheltenham. Mrs. Hartnell, her lips already pursed with curiosity, waved her over with the air of one about to share a private confidence disguised as harmless village talk. "There now, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice. "This came in overnight. No stamp, no address, and only one thing inside." She placed the contents on the counter. A small faded photograph of a woman, young, pale, and rigid, with an expression that might have once longed to smile but never quite dared. The image was sepia-toned, clearly aged, and the woman's attire suggested a period well before the war. Behind her stood a modest thatched cottage, its ivy overgrowth and twisted gates suggesting disuse. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and leaned in. She said nothing, but her silence was the thoughtful kind. There was something faintly unsettling about the photograph, not merely the woman's expression, but the stillness of her posture. It was not the sort of stillness found in studio portraits, but rather one born of endurance. She stood with her hands clasped just out of sight, her gaze level and unsmiling, as though she understood too well the nature of being captured and chose to meet it head-on. But it was the background that caught Miss Marple's eye. The cottage behind the woman, though unremarkable to most, stirred a memory, one she had not visited in some years. The sagging gatepost, the particular twist of the iron hinge, and the ivy curling in a manner only neglect could inspire. Yes, she was quite certain. The cottage stood, or rather, had once stood, on the edge of Fallow Banks, a neighboring village of modest repute and storied silences. It had not been inhabited for decades, not since the family who once owned it had disappeared with little explanation and even less ceremony. Miss Marple could recall vaguely a scandal involving a governess or nursery maid, though the details, like the cottage, had been left to weather with time. By mid-week, the envelope had made its way, by way of village curiosity and Mrs. Hartnell's gentle insistence, into the hands of Mrs. Hayward, the vicar's wife. Mrs. Hayward was known for her balanced temperament and appreciation for a well-ordered narrative, even where village matters were concerned. She examined the envelope once more before opening the folded slip of paper that accompanied the photograph. There were no words, only a neatly printed line across the page. "To whom it may concern." No name, no date, no further explanation. Mrs. Hayward, a woman not prone to flights of fancy, suggested it may well be the work of a student at the art college or an eccentric collector of village folklore. "But really," she added with a crease forming between her brows, "it's the eyes. They are far too vivid for fiction." Miss Marple agreed, though she did not say so aloud. She had seen too many faces in her lifetime, too many expressions carefully arranged to hide desperation or sorrow. The woman in the photograph had not been caught unawares. She had looked into the camera, not with fear or hope, but with resignation, as though she knew what the world would do with her likeness, and had stopped resisting it. It was 2 days later, just as the village was turning its thoughts toward Michaelmas preparations, that whispers began to ripple through Fallowbanks. Mrs. Tilling from the greengrocer's had been the first to say it aloud, though others had seen her too. A woman, pale and finely dressed in a style that seemed curiously out of place, walking slowly along the lane near Hawthorne Grange. She had not spoken, nor had she paused. Her stride had been steady, her eyes fixed ahead, but it was the absence of expression that made people uncomfortable. The unnerving calm of her countenance, like a memory walking in daylight. Several swore she looked precisely like the woman in the photograph. One child claimed she passed without casting a shadow, though such exaggerations were typical of youthful imaginations. Miss Marple, upon hearing this from Mrs. Hartnell the next morning, sat very still in her chair. She did not laugh, nor did she dismiss the stories as village theatre. Instead, she turned her attention inward, weighing coincidence against instinct. And when she stood at last, it was not with haste, but with the calm deliberation of one who senses that an old door has quietly been opened. Miss Marple had always believed that the past, however deeply buried, never truly stayed underground. It had a way of shifting beneath one's feet, like loose earth beneath a grave, and revealing itself when least expected. That morning after tea, she penned a discreet note to an old acquaintance in the land registry, and later made a courtesy visit to Miss Weatherby, whose memory for genealogies and scandals rivaled any indexed record. Their conversation, seemingly benign, turned to old cottages, former tenants, and those best forgotten. It was through such unassuming methods that Miss Marple began to stitch together a name long unspoken. Margaret Elston, a nursery maid, dismissed suddenly in 1912, unwed, unseen since. Miss Marple did not yet know how the photograph, the stranger, and the forgotten cottage aligned, but she sensed, as surely as she sensed weather in her bones, that Fallowbanks was about to remember something it had long tried to forget. Mr. Giles Keene arrived without fanfare, though his well-cut coat and carefully pressed cuffs hinted at a life lived among dusty ledgers and quiet inheritances. He was not a young man, nor particularly old, but he bore the air of someone who had grown accustomed to the weight of other people's secrets. The villagers, naturally attuned to the presence of strangers, noticed his arrival at the King's Arms just after luncheon, and the whisper traveled faster than his modest luggage could be carried upstairs. He introduced himself politely, almost apologetically, to the innkeeper, and explained that he was in the area on probate business. An old client, he added vaguely, left instructions to settle a matter in the vicinity of Fallowbanks. When pressed for details, he merely said, "A woman once employed here many years ago, Margaret Elston. I wonder if the name is known to anyone still living." The question, though asked with professional detachment, did not quite ring hollow. There was something in his voice, something that suggested the request was more than clerical. That afternoon he was seen walking alone, hands clasped behind his back, pausing occasionally to read names etched on weathered gravestones or to observe the derelict path leading toward the old grange on the hill. Miss Marple, upon hearing of the solicitor's visit, made no comment, but she made a mental note of his name and his interest in Margaret Elston, a name she had not heard in decades, but one that had lingered like dust caught between the pages of an old book. The name Elston had, for most in Fallowbanks, passed into that special category of village memory. Too old for certainty, too delicate for discussion. Yet once spoken aloud again, it stirred something in the collective conscience, like a bell, faintly heard in fog. Mrs. Larch from the dress shop recalled that the Elston girl had worked at Hawthorne Grange before the Great War, though she couldn't quite remember who had dismissed her, or why. Old Mr. Willows, who delivered coal before arthritis slowed him, muttered something about a child that had never been named, and Mrs. Pierce, whose mother had once been in service at the Grange, insisted there had been a fire, though as she could not recall what had burned. Most remembered Margaret Elston as a quiet girl, neither particularly liked nor disliked. She had been one of those women who left no strong impression, except that her eyes had seemed too wide and too watchful for someone so young. She had vanished one spring, shortly before Easter, and her departure had been as wordless as her time in the village. No farewell, no letter, just absence. The solicitor's question, though posed with disinterest, brought forth discomfort. Old names carry weight in English villages, and some are best left where they lie, beneath soil, beneath scandal, beneath silence. Yet now it was clear that Margaret Elston's name had not been quite so buried as everyone had assumed, and Miss Marple, sipping her tea with deliberate calm, found herself wondering, why now? What string had been tugged, and by whom? Miss Marple was not one to barge through the front door of a mystery. She believed firmly in the power of tact and timing, both of which she employed during a well-timed visit to Mrs. Price Ridley the following morning. The elder woman, a former doyenne of the local dramatic society, now confined to more sedate pursuits due to nerves, received Miss Marple with an air of strained hospitality and a plate of slightly stale shortbread. Conversation began, as it should, with church matters, the indecency of nylon clothing, and the lamentable modern habit of quick engagements. Only once Mrs. Price Ridley had poured the second cup did Miss Marple casually mention the name, Margaret Elston. A flicker. Barely perceptible, but enough. Mrs. Price Ridley made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a scoff. "If I recall," she said thinly, "the girl was involved in some difficulty. Nothing ever proved, you understand, but one hears things in confidence. She was rather pretty in a mouse-like way, and those types are often the most troublesome. There were whispers." Miss Marple nodded not too eagerly. She knew better than to challenge or question too directly. "There was a situation," Mrs. Price Ridley added, almost involuntarily, "before the war, entirely unfortunate, and naturally hushed up. That," Miss Marple thought as she left, was the sound of a woman trying not to remember something she had once known too well. The Grange had not been mentioned for years, and yet it loomed still, its very absence a kind of presence in the village. Hawthorne Grange, once home to the Carraway family, had fallen into disrepair following the Colonel's death and a series of disputed claims upon the estate. The windows were now boarded, and ivy crept across the chimney breasts, like veins on an aging hand. Miss Marple, upon returning home, took down her black notebook, reserved not for lists or shopping, but for recollections less easily categorized. She confirmed what she had long suspected. Margaret Elston had indeed been in service at the Grange from 1910 to early 1912. A nursery maid, according to the household register. Nothing in her departure had been noted, simply left March. No reason, no recommendation. The Colonel's daughter, Arabella, had been a sickly child in those days, often absent from public gatherings. There had been talk of tutors, private nurses, and the kind of isolation that befalls families with more pride than ease. But what struck Miss Marple most was not what had been written, but what had not. No other mention of Margaret appeared thereafter, not in births, nor bans, nor deaths. She had simply vanished. And now, it seemed, someone, perhaps not she, but someone very like her, had returned. The autumn dusk settled early, casting long shadows along the lane toward Hawthorne Grange. Children were called in early that evening, not for weather nor chores, but out of a vague unease their mothers could not quite name. It was Mr. Cleves, the retired schoolmaster, who later claimed to have seen her first. He had been walking the path past the Grange when he paused, sensing, more than seeing, a figure near the gate. There, standing as though summoned by time itself, was the woman from the photograph. The same rigid stance, the same unchanging expression. She gazed at the crumbling facade of the house as if memorizing it, or perhaps mourning it. She neither turned nor spoke when Mr. Cleves passed. He in turn quickened his pace, troubled more by what she didn't do than what she did. By morning her presence had become a whisper, threaded through every conversation at the post office, the market, and the chapel. A stranger who said nothing, asked nothing, but looked as though she had already heard everything. Miss Marple, on hearing the account, sat very still. It was not that she believed in ghosts. She did not. But she believed quite firmly that guilt could linger in a place. And if Margaret Elston had indeed returned, in person or in blood, she had not done so idly. It was the milkman who found her. His cart had come to a reluctant halt on the narrow lane just past the overgrown path to Hawthorne Grange, and it was only by chance, prompted by the soft thud of his boot against something unseen, that he turned his head and glimpsed her lying there, half curtained by ivy and fallen leaves. She appeared asleep at first glance. Her body rested lightly against the crumbling garden wall, as if it had been arranged that way, not slumped, but composed. Her face, pale and unmistakably calm, was touched by the faintest trace of a smile, the kind one sees only on those who have known either complete peace or absolute surrender. The constable, summoned shortly thereafter, declared it likely a natural death. Collapse, perhaps, he muttered, examining her gloved hands and neat coat. There were no visible injuries, no marks of violence. The weather had been cool, the air damp, conditions known to claim the heart, especially if weakened by time or strain. She carried no purse, no papers. Nothing to indicate who she was, though more than one villager, glancing at her still features from a distance, murmured that she looked precisely like the woman in the photograph. Miss Marple, upon hearing of the discovery from young Dora at the post office, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. The mystery had shifted. Where once there was unease, now there was finality. But in that finality, especially that peculiar smile, there lingered a question not yet answered. The doctor, a man of measured temperament and no appetite for complications, examined the body with brisk efficiency. There was no sign of trauma. Her heart, he explained, had likely given out from stress or perhaps a long unaddressed condition. There would be no need for a post-mortem unless the family insisted, and there appeared to be no family at all. It was during the examination of her clothing that the detail emerged, small, odd, and entirely incongruous. Tucked within the seam of her inner coat pocket, beneath a worn handkerchief, lay a pressed violet, fragile, papery, perfectly preserved, and entirely out of season. No one could recall seeing violets bloom that year past early June, and now it was mid-October. The flower had not been picked recently. It had been kept with care, perhaps for years. It bore the scent of something private, something sacred. Miss Marple was not told immediately, but she knew, not from the newspapers or from official sources, but from Mrs. Chittenden, whose niece had overheard the constable discussing it over tea. Gossip travels most quickly when softened by milk and sugar. To the casual observer, the violet might mean nothing. A sentimental token, perhaps. But Miss Marple, whose mind held dozens of such quiet symbols and their meanings, understood that this particular violet was a message, not to the world, but to the woman herself. A memory folded into fabric, a secret never spoken, but always carried. And suddenly, the smile upon her lips made more sense. She had come back not to speak, but to remember. The village, never fond of silence when words might serve instead, began to murmur. Whispers bloomed like fungus after rain, quiet, damp, and persistent. Though the constable had spoken of natural causes, the villagers were unconvinced. People did not simply appear, then die. Not without purpose. Not here. Not in Fallow Banks. Mrs. Donnelly, who worked the church flowers and rarely trusted anyone under 60, declared it was poison, plain and simple. "There's always a look about poisoned people," she insisted to Mrs. Finch. "And that smile, it's not natural." Mr. Tyler, who claimed to have seen the woman walk past Hawthorne Grange, now amended his account. "She didn't blink," he said. "Didn't turn her head. That's not walking. That's haunting." Some blamed the house itself. It had always been touched by misfortune, they said. Fires, failures, family troubles too delicate to speak of plainly. Others recalled odd details they had never noticed before. Birds that no longer sang near the gate, children who avoided the lane instinctively. Miss Marple, walking home from the baker's with a small loaf and her thoughts for company, noted these conversations but did not contribute. Theories built on fear rarely revealed truth. But what they did reveal, quite reliably, was the emotional temperature of a village trying to reconcile a mystery with its desire for peace. She considered how quickly people moved to the idea of ghosts when the truth threatened to feel too personal. A ghost, after all, could be forgotten in daylight. A wronged woman could not. Miss Marple's memory, unlike those of her neighbors, was less inclined to exaggerate and more attuned to detail. The violet, that small, silent bloom tucked into the deceased's coat, had stirred something. Not a fact precisely, but a feeling. A trace of something once told in whispers, now woven into village myth. It was the phrase, "Grange violet," that emerged in her thoughts, a term used long ago, and with the kind of reverence reserved for both tragedy and shame. The story had never been formally recorded, but it had traveled through parlor rooms, shared quietly among the older women during embroidery circles, or beside the fire after church. The girl had been young. A nursery maid employed at Hawthorne Grange during Arabella Carraway's infancy. She had fallen pregnant, the story went. Though no father had ever been named, she had been dismissed quietly, sent away before questions could be asked, let alone answered. The Grange, protective of its name and proud of its lineage, had closed ranks. The violets had mattered then. The girl had worn them, it was said, once in her hair, later at her throat. And when she vanished, she was last seen plucking them from the garden, her expression unreadable. It was a sad story, mostly forgotten. But Miss Marple did not forget. She had always believed the past had a longer reach than most imagined. And now, decades later, a woman bearing no name had arrived, carried a violet, and died at the Grange's edge. There were, Miss Marple reflected, no coincidences in such things, only consequences delayed. Miss Marple returned to Hawthorne Grange not long after the funeral arrangements had been quietly made. The grounds, untended for years, bore the weary weight of forgotten gardens. Ivy strangled the lower stonework. Brambles clung to rusted gates. The place did not repel her. It called to her, though not unkindly. She moved slowly along the broken path that once led to the kitchen entrance. Her steps were not idle. She had come not to mourn, but to understand. The mind, when focused by purpose, often sees what others overlook. Near the garden wall, where the woman had been found, her eye caught the glint of something pale tucked between the roots of ivy and moss. It was a page, torn, browned by time, but astonishingly intact. The handwriting was juvenile, the ink faded but legible. The heading bore a single name, Arabella, and beneath the date, April 12th, 1912. She read it standing upright, the air still about her. The words were fragmented but clear enough. There was mention of fire, of secrets, of a promise never kept. She cried when she left, one line read. But she never said a word, just smiled and picked a violet. I promised not to tell. Miss Marple folded the page carefully and placed it within her glove. It was not the whole story, but it was proof of a child who had witnessed more than she understood, of a servant girl wronged, and perhaps of a legacy still seeking its rightful place. The silence around her did not feel empty now. It felt waiting. The handwriting, though childlike, bore the careful penmanship of a girl raised under the strict expectations of both society and silence. Miss Marple, with her decades of acquaintance with all manner of feminine expression, knew immediately that the page she had discovered had not belonged to a servant. The loops were deliberate, the capital letters shaped with the precision that came only from private tutoring and discipline. The name at the top, Arabella, confirmed what instinct had already suggested. Arabella Carroway had been the only child of Colonel and Mrs. Carroway, the former owners of Hawthorne Grange. Much had been made in earlier years of her delicate constitution, her frequent absences from the public eye, and the secluded nature of her upbringing. She had married late and moved to Bath, where she had lived quietly until her death some years ago. Childless, it was believed. Yet the diary page, dated April 1912, placed Arabella at the heart of the mystery surrounding Margaret Elston. It was she who had witnessed something, a departure, a fire, and a promise made under pressure. The language was hesitant, veiled in the sort of euphemism a child might use when recording something adult and confusing. But the tone was unmistakable. Sorrow, regret, and an unspoken sense of guilt. Miss Marple traced her fingers across the uneven edge of the paper and reflected that children, though often shielded from the truths of adult life, observed far more than they were given credit for. And Arabella, it seemed, had observed everything. The question that remained was not whether she had known Margaret's secret, but whether she had carried it with her to the grave. The child's words, though tentative, painted a shadowy tableau of events long buried. The fire, it seemed, had not been one of sweeping destruction, but of something smaller, more symbolic. A blaze set in a hearth, perhaps, or the burning of personal belongings. Arabella's entry made mention of a smell that lingered, of adults speaking in tight voices behind closed doors, and of the hurried packing of a trunk. The key phrase, repeated twice, was, "She didn't smile." The girl, Margaret, though unnamed in the entry, had walked away from the house without tears, without words, and without expression. Arabella, with a child's keen sense of injustice, noted that Margaret had done nothing wrong but was sent away, and that Mama said it was better this way. But it was the broken promise that caught Miss Marple's attention. "I said I wouldn't tell," the diary confessed, "but I didn't know it would be forever." That vow of silence, likely coerced, possibly misunderstood, had held firm for over 40 years. Miss Marple folded the page once more and replaced it gently among her notes. The nature of secrets, she knew, was such that time did not soften their consequences. It merely allowed them to ripen until the moment came when they could no longer be contained. That moment, it seemed, had arrived. But if Arabella had tried to forget the past, someone else had not. Someone had remembered. And someone, Miss Marple suspected, had found reason to fear that old promises were about to be broken. When Mr. Giles Keene next called upon Miss Marple, he appeared considerably less composed than during his previous inquiries. He sat stiffly in the parlor chair, his hat held between his knees, and only accepted tea after a polite insistence. There was something restless in the way his eyes darted to the clock, as if time itself had become an adversary. "I believe," he began haltingly, "that I may not have been entirely candid during our last conversation." Miss Marple nodded gently but said nothing. He proceeded to explain that before her death, Margaret Elston, or the woman believed to be her daughter, had written him a final letter. It had been enclosed with instructions regarding a small estate and a list of names, none of which he had recognized at the time. What troubled him was the closing line. "There is someone still watching, someone who never forgot." The phrase had struck him as dramatic, even sentimental, but in light of her sudden death it no longer felt innocuous. Miss Marple asked if any of the names on the list had belonged to local residents. Mr. Keene admitted that one had stood out, a Price Ridley. No Christian name, no context, just the surname. It was then, Miss Marple thought, that the story began to coil in upon itself. The solicitor had brought the past into the present, and in doing so, had stirred more than memories. The warning was clear. The woman had not come alone. She had come pursued. And somewhere in Fallowbanks, someone had watched her arrive, and made certain she would not leave. Among those whose names had resurfaced through whispers and speculation was Peter Latham, son of the long-deceased groundskeeper at Hawthorne Grange. Now elderly and largely forgotten, he lived in a tumble-down cottage at the edge of Fallowbanks, and rarely spoke to anyone beyond the grocer's boy and the occasional errand from the parish. Miss Marple remembered him well enough. He had been a quiet child, unusually tall for his age, with a manner that was more shadow than substance. He had once shown a fondness for Margaret Elston that had not gone unnoticed by the household. Not improper, perhaps, but observant. Too observant, for a boy meant to sweep leaves and mind flower beds. At the time of Margaret's dismissal, Peter had been sent away to live with an uncle in Basingstoke. The suddenness of that arrangement had drawn comment at the time, but had later been forgotten, as war loomed. Miss Marple, careful in her inquiries, learned that Peter had returned shortly after the war, and had remained ever since. Reclusive, yes, but not unknowing. A man who listened more than he spoke, who watched from windows and hedgerows, and who kept, according to rumor, a box of pressed flowers in a drawer near his bed. It was enough to raise suspicion, though not enough to confirm guilt. A red herring, perhaps, but a compelling one. Miss Marple did not accuse, nor judge. She merely noted. In mysteries such as these, love left unattended could rot into something unrecognizable. And sometimes the deepest motives came not from hatred, but from devotion twisted by time. The envelope arrived without fanfare, delivered not through the usual post, but slipped through the parlor door one evening, just before supper. The paper was cream, thick, and unremarkable, save for the shaky script inked across its face. For your eyes only. Miss Marple opened it with the careful fingers of someone long familiar with the weight of words. Inside was a single sheet, folded once, bearing only 2 lines. Leave the past to the dead, or you shall join them sooner than you think. There was no signature, no identifying mark, no scent upon the paper, no watermark beneath the grain. The message, like so many before it, cloaked itself in anonymity while betraying its urgency. Miss Marple held the note between her fingers for a moment, then placed it gently upon the tea tray. She was neither frightened nor surprised. She had, after all, stirred a pot that others preferred left crusted at the bottom. What struck her most was the tone. Not anger, but desperation. Someone was afraid. Someone with much to lose. She thought again of the names in Mr. Keene's letter, of the violet, of Arabella's forgotten diary entry, and of the woman who had returned after a lifetime of silence only to die at the threshold of memory. It was not just a murder she was dealing with. It was a legacy, one of betrayal, concealment, and shame stitched into the very fabric of fallow banks. And now that the shadows had begun to whisper, Miss Marple knew the light would not come easily. It was Mr. Cleves, the retired schoolmaster, who inadvertently set the discovery in motion while aiding a young builder tasked with assessing the structural remains of Hawthorne Grange. As loose plaster gave way in what had once been the drawing room, a narrow void was revealed, no more than a hand's width behind the paneled wall. Within, covered in dust but otherwise untouched, hung a single portrait. Word traveled quickly, as it does in villages where time meanders but gossip gallops. Miss Marple, upon hearing of the painting, requested permission to view it. The moment her eyes fell upon the canvas, she recognized the unsmiling face. The woman in the painting was the woman from the photograph, not merely similar in pose or attire, but identical in her chilling composure. The date etched into the brass plate beneath read 1913. The artist's name was unfamiliar, but the likeness was precise, deliberate in its effort to capture not beauty, but restraint. The background bore the soft detailing of the drawing room as it had once stood, a fire screen, a rosewood side table, and beneath the sitter's folded hands, a violet resting on her lap. It was not a family portrait, for no family name had been attached, nor was it a piece meant for display. It had been hidden, tucked behind years of silence, as though its presence had been both unbearable and necessary. Miss Marple stared at the eyes, still and unflinching, and thought, not for the first time, that a portrait could reveal more in its silence than a dozen testimonials might in their noise. Miss Marple's next step, taken with her usual blend of courtesy and calculation, was a visit to Mrs. Dunbury, the widow of Colonel Carroway's long-retired solicitor. The widow, now well into her 80s and residing with a niece in Eastbourne, welcomed the call with mild suspicion softened by tea and shared memories. As conversation meandered from village matters to legal legacies, Miss Marple made an oblique reference to the Colonel's affairs during the spring of 1913. The mention of Hawthorne Grange and its nursery staff stirred something in the old woman's expression, a flicker of remembered discomfort. Mrs. Dunbury did not volunteer names, but she did offer a story. There had been, she said, a matter quietly handled by her late husband at the Colonel's urgent request. A girl, a servant, had given birth. The child was not registered in the usual way, but arrangements were made. A trusted family elsewhere took the infant. Money exchanged hands, and no documentation beyond private letters ever existed. The matter had been described in the ledger as charitable disbursement. It had troubled her husband, not for its illegality, though it skirted the edges, But for its coldness, the girl, he had said, had begged to keep the child. She was dismissed instead. Miss Marple asked ever so gently if the girl's name had been Elston. The widow, after a moment's silence, nodded once. And so, the veil parted slightly. The dead woman, unnamed and unsmiling, had not come as a stranger. She had returned to the place where her life had been concealed from its very beginning. With the pieces quietly aligning, Miss Marple no longer needed speculation, only confirmation. The woman who had walked the lanes of fallow banks in eerie silence was not Margaret Elston, as many had initially thought, but her daughter. A daughter born in secrecy, surrendered without consent, and raised with questions carefully left unanswered. The resemblance to the portrait, painted just months after the child's birth, had not been incidental. It was a clue, one deliberately preserved. Perhaps Margaret had possessed a copy. Perhaps she had passed it on with a whispered promise. Find this house. Find yourself. Miss Marple's mind turned to the letter Mr. Keene had referenced, in which the deceased had hinted at someone still watching. It had not been fear that drove her return. It had been purpose. She had come not to accuse, but to understand. She had walked those paths not as a ghost, but as someone seeking a reflection that matched her own. She had visited no one, spoken to no villager, issued no claim, and yet her presence had unsettled the community more than any threat might have done, because her face, Margaret's face, had returned like a question they had all agreed never to ask. Miss Marple considered the weight of such silence. A child brought into the world without name or right, walking again through the village that had erased her. The truth was simple, and in that simplicity lay the cruelty. She had not wanted revenge. She had wanted to be seen. And someone, fearing what that might mean, had ensured that she never would be again. The incident occurred during a modest gathering at the vicarage, one of those occasions at which nothing of note is expected, and where, for that very reason, the unexpected thrives. Miss Marple had invited Mr. Keene to tea, along with a handful of innocuous guests, under the pretext of discussing parish archives. The solicitor, though wearied from recent events, accepted graciously and appeared in his usual state, cordial, tidy, faintly distracted. He conversed politely, asked nothing unusual, and reached instinctively for the teacup placed before Miss Marple when she momentarily stepped away to assist Mrs. Hayward with the silver spoons. He drank half before the first sign appeared, a tremor of the hand, followed by a sharp intake of breath and a faltering sentence. Within minutes, he was pale and trembling, unable to stand. The gathering dissolved into alarm, and the doctor was summoned. By evening, the verdict had been issued. He would recover. It had been a sudden and alarming reaction, likely due to a mild toxin or irritant. But no source could be identified with certainty. The doctor advised rest and caution. The village, however, was less forgiving. Word spread that the teacup had not been his, that it had been meant for Miss Marple. And so the whispers began anew. Someone, it was said, had grown fearful of her investigations. Someone had hoped that tea might silence what tact had not. Miss Marple made no accusations, but she did not drink from that set again. In the days that followed Mr. Keene's collapse, no figure in fallow banks drew more curious glances than Mrs. Price Ridley. The formerly poised and authoritative widow, known for her ironed handkerchiefs and unwavering opinions, was seen unpinned and visibly discomposed. Her errands, once swift and strategic, became hesitant. She lingered too long at the grocer's, misspoke names at the post office, and failed to appear for her bridge engagement at Mrs. Larch's. All of which, in a village of habits, did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple, far too experienced to mistake nervousness for proof, nonetheless noted the woman's change in rhythm. Mrs. Price Ridley, when encountered near the churchyard, offered too many words, too quickly, and seemed determined to redirect the conversation toward foreign politics and the failings of modern clergy. There had been, after all, a connection, however tangential. Her family had once been close to the Carraways, her brother a young officer in the colonel's regiment. His name, Miss Marple recalled, had surfaced in other contexts, quietly and with caution. It was conceivable, then, that Mrs. Price Ridley knew more than she let on. Whether that knowledge was guilty in nature or merely protective, however, was not yet clear. She had been rattled, that much was certain. But so are many who fear truths that expose wounds rather than crimes. Miss Marple folded her hands and, with the soft patience of someone accustomed to peeling back layers of appearance, resolved that the time for quiet questions had ended. The next move, she knew, must invite revelation. Miss Marple had long since learned that houses, like people, rarely give up their secrets all at once. It was only when the portrait's frame was carefully removed from its hiding place behind the crumbling plaster that a narrow envelope fluttered from the backboard, sealed not with wax, but bound by a violet ribbon, now brittle with age. The handwriting, though faded, was instantly recognizable to those who had seen Colonel Carraway's military notations, angular, precise, and steeped in formality. Miss Marple took her time reading it, not out of hesitation but respect. Some letters, she knew, were not meant for scandal but for sorrow. It was addressed simply to M.E., and its contents were brief. The Colonel, writing in March of 1912, pleaded for Margaret's departure from Hawthorne Grange. He spoke not of affection, but of duty, his to his wife, to his family name, to public appearance. He acknowledged her condition, expressed regret, and enclosed funds. There was no mention of love, only the repeated request that she leave quietly, and never return. Miss Marple, having folded the letter with great care, thought not only of what was written, but of what had been left unsaid. A man may disguise cruelty as civility, especially when reputation is at stake. But a girl dismissed with a child, and without acknowledgement, bore the full cost of such discretion. The letter, sealed with a violet and silence, was never sent. Or perhaps it was returned. Either way, it had not prevented Margaret's daughter from finding her way back. The violet had appeared 3 times now, once pressed into a coat pocket, once painted in the woman's lap, and now, again, in ribbon form, sealing a letter never meant for public eyes. Such repetitions, Miss Marple believed, were rarely coincidental. In her experience, lovers, especially those forced apart, often chose symbols more permanent than promises. To the Carraways and their circle, violets had no particular significance. But in the language of flowers, as understood by those raised on Victorian sensibilities, violets signified faithfulness, modesty, and quiet sorrow. Qualities unsuited to public scandal, yet perfectly suited to Margaret Elston. The use of the violet was not grand, not theatrical. It was gentle, secretive, chosen by someone who loved not in boldness but in concealment. Miss Marple found herself considering that Colonel Carraway, though responsible for Margaret's dismissal, may have once held genuine affection. But love, she knew, could be as cowardly as it was noble. A moment's fear for reputation could eclipse years of affection. The woman who had died, the daughter, had kept the violet as others might keep a family name. It was her inheritance, her proof of origin. She had worn no badge, claimed no estate, but she had carried the emblem of that long-buried union. And in that emblem, Miss Marple saw a love story reduced to caution, one where shame had bloomed as fully as feeling, and where a flower had become the sole remaining evidence of something that, for a brief moment in 1912, had been tender. But tenderness, when unacknowledged, curdles. And it was that curdling, not vengeance, that had returned to Fallowbanks. It was not the return itself that had disturbed the village. It was what the return threatened to uncover. Miss Marple considered not for the first time that the woman's death, sudden, natural as it might appear, had occurred with astonishing convenience. She had come seeking answers. Not scandal, not revenge, merely understanding. But understanding has a way of unsettling those who have profited from forgetting. And Fallowbanks, for all its charm, possessed a remarkable memory for gossip and a remarkable forgetfulness for guilt. There were individuals still living who had been close to the Carraway household. Mrs. Price Ridley's brother, once a military protégé of the Colonel, had visited the Grange often. A few, like the groundskeeper's son, had witnessed events they never fully processed. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on someone with more to lose, someone who had invested a lifetime in preserving appearances. The tea incident could not be dismissed, nor could the anonymous note. Miss Marple now believed that the woman had been intercepted, perhaps not murdered, but confronted. Her fragile heart, already worn thin by decades of searching, had been dealt a final blow, not by poison, but by fear. Whoever had spoken to her last had done so with the intent to silence, perhaps not permanently, but effectively, and it had worked, until now. Because even in death the woman had spoken, her smile, her violet, her silence. They had told the truth in fragments. It was Miss Marple's task to assemble them, and she would. Not to punish, necessarily, but to ensure that this time someone would listen. It was Miss Weatherby, an amateur historian with a penchant for detail, who unearthed the final artifact. In a modest valise left behind at the inn, amid ordinary belongings, a well-worn prayer book, a lace-edged handkerchief, a tin of cough lozenges, lay a compact mirror. Silver, circular, modest in size, and engraved delicately on the back. A C. The initials, at first glance, offered little clarity. Arabella Carraway had long since passed, but the mirror's age, its style, and the faint outline of the Grange's crest beneath the letters suggested it had once belonged to her. Whether it had been gifted, stolen, or inherited was uncertain, but its presence among the woman's things raised questions too pressing to ignore. If the mirror had been Arabella's, how had it come into the hands of the woman who now lay buried without a name? Had she received it as proof, or had she taken it back as her own? Miss Marple examined the item carefully. The surface bore the faint scratches of decades, but within, the glass still reflected clearly. She thought about how the woman might have looked into it, searching not for vanity, but resemblance. To hold such a mirror, engraved with the initials of the woman who may have been her half-sister, was to hold a sliver of truth. It was not confirmation from a birth certificate, but it was something far more intimate, a piece of the life she had been denied. And it had not been flaunted. It had been carried quietly, just like the violet, as if she knew that her identity would not be granted by others. She would have to carry it herself, and carry it she had, right to the doorstep of the family who had never spoken her name. Miss Marple never stormed battlements. She laid tables. And so, when the time came to unravel the final knot, she extended invitations in the manner most natural to her. A quiet gathering at the vicarage for afternoon tea. A simple gesture seasoned with civility and garnished with implication. Those invited could hardly refuse. Mr. Keene, still pale from his recent collapse, accepted with quiet reluctance. Mrs. Price Ridley, stiff-backed and over-perfumed, arrived with exaggerated punctuality. Even Peter Latham, coaxed from his garden path, attended without objection. Tea was poured, scones passed, and conversation began in the usual rhythm, harmless chatter seasoned with unease. But beneath the clinking of cups, tension curdled in the air. Everyone knew why they were there, even if no one spoke of it. Miss Marple waited as only she could, until the moment when silence begged to be filled. And then, gently, like one brushing dust from a forgotten heirloom, she began to speak. She spoke of a letter never sent, of a violet never forgotten, of a woman denied but returned. She recounted the compact, the initials, the diary, the death, each detail laid not as accusation, but as invitation, to memory, to conscience, to truth. When she paused, it was not for effect, but because the final truth no longer needed announcement. It sat in the room with them. No one confessed. No tears were shed. But something shifted, subtle and irreversible. The story had been hidden too long. And now, like tea left too long to steep, the bitterness had finally risen to the surface. There was nothing particularly unusual about a gathering at the vicarage. In fact, it was the very ordinariness of it that made it such an ideal setting. Tea was a most agreeable cloak under which truths could be gently coaxed into the open. And Miss Marple, who knew the rhythm of village life, as well as she knew the contents of her own sewing basket, chose her invitations with care. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived first, wrapped in a shawl too heavy for the weather, and a disposition too brittle for comfort. Mr. Keene followed, paler than usual but composed. Peter Latham appeared last, reluctant but oddly calm, as though summoned by instinct more than will. Tea was served with gentle efficiency, china cups, lemon slices, and scones with gooseberry jam. The conversation began with the usual remarks: the weather, the church roof, the peculiar behavior of post-war biscuits. But beneath the pleasantries, silence gathered like a shadow in the corners. Miss Marple allowed it to grow. She sipped her tea, nodded at the right intervals, and when the talk thinned as she had known it would, she simply said in that quiet, unassuming way of hers, "Some things, once buried, have a way of blooming again." There was no need for explanation. Each guest understood the subject unspoken. And so, with no accusations, no raised voices, and no dramatic confessions, the true purpose of the gathering unfolded. Not to confront, but to reveal. The truth had already made itself known. It only needed someone brave enough to acknowledge it. Miss Marple, of course, had always believed that courage came in many forms. Sometimes it arrived with a tray of tea, and the quiet resolve to name what others would rather leave in silence. It was a comment too pointed to be idle that prompted Mrs. Price Ridley's undoing. Miss Marple had spoken gently of Arabella Carroway's diary, and of the letter never posted, and the older woman's teacup had rattled ever so slightly against its saucer. It was not shock that betrayed her. It was recognition. She had known. Miss Marple, never one to press too harshly, simply allowed the silence to speak. Mrs. Price Ridley filled it. "Yes," she said finally, her voice as tight as lace drawn too sharply. "Arabella confided in me. We were close, as girls often are when raised under the same shadowed roof." She spoke not with remorse, but with weariness. It had been her brother, an officer and guest at Hawthorne Grange during the spring of 1912, who had been implicated, however discreetly, in Margaret Elston's disgrace. A dalliance, hushed at the time, yet impossible to erase once it bore consequence. The adoption had been arranged swiftly, the girl dismissed without ceremony. Arabella had written it down because she could not bear to speak of it, and Mrs. Price Ridley had guarded the secret as though her own reputation depended on it, and indeed, it had. Her brother's war record had not survived scrutiny, and disgrace had hovered for years like a phantom over her family name. The return of Margaret's daughter had threatened to stir that dormant shame. "I could not bear it coming back," she admitted. "Not after all these years. We were just girls. How could we have known what would linger?" Miss Marple offered no rebuke. It was not malice, but fear that had guided her. Fear preserved over time can harden into something that looks very much like guilt. And yet, the truth, once aired, settled softly in the room. Once the silence had absorbed Mrs. Price Ridley's confession, Miss Marple turned to the matter that had too long been misunderstood. The woman who had walked so quietly through the village, who had died with a violet in her coat and a mirror in her bag, had come not to accuse, but to understand. "She came," Miss Marple said gently, "not to disrupt nor to shame anyone. She sought only the truth of herself." The guests said nothing, but their faces shifted, as though realizing that what they had feared had never truly existed. The woman had not carried anger in her step. She had not shouted, demanded, or revealed her lineage to any who might hear it. She had simply walked to the places that might hold answers, and left no imprint but her presence. Her death had been seen by many as a consequence of scandal or punishment, but it had been something far more human. She had sought a name, a thread in the tangle of her past to tie her identity to something real. She wanted to know where she belonged, Miss Marple continued, as any of us might had we been born into silence. Even Mr. Keene, who had seen too much of the world's legal cruelties, looked away with a faint grimace of regret. No claim had been made on the estate. No family court stirred. No motive but knowing. Miss Marple did not indulge sentiment, but she believed in kindness and in the understanding that not all truths are born from conflict. Some come simply because a heart grows weary of shadows and wishes, at last, to stand in the light. And now, Miss Marple thought, she had done just that, though the cost had been final. The doctor had written the cause of death as heart failure, and medically, he was correct. The woman had suffered no visible injury, no trace of foul substance, no wound but the stillness that overtook her on that damp October morning. And yet Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that death often arrived with motives far subtler than poison. "It was fear," she said softly, "and grief worn too long. The woman's heart had likely always been delicate. A life spent without answers can fray even the strongest fibers of spirit. But Miss Marple believed it was the encounter, quiet, unrecorded, never spoken, that had broken her resolve. Someone had spoken to her, someone who knew the past, and who feared its unveiling. It had not been violence, but denial. A confrontation perhaps intended to dissuade or even frighten. A warning wrapped in civility. A reminder that she was not welcome. But she had come so far, carried her mother's absence in silence, and arrived with only memory and instinct as her compass. And when the truth stood just within reach, when a name might have been spoken aloud, she was met instead with shame. The strain of being unseen once again, of finding the door shut, was more than her fragile heart could bear. Miss Marple did not need proof to understand that cruelty often wears gloves, that some deaths come not with a scream, but with a sigh, that some murders are not written in blood, but in the refusal to let someone exist. And so, her body failed her. But the truth had not. It remained, like the violet, small, soft, and impossible to ignore. She had been found with a smile. It was the detail that had puzzled everyone. the expression so soft, so unlike what might accompany sudden death. And now, as the truth hung gently in the air like dust in sunlit silence, it made sense. She had seen the house. She had walked its overgrown path. She had held the mirror, perhaps looked into it and recognized at last her own face in another's. She had read the letter, or a copy of it. She had found what she had come for. Not in words, not in a handshake or a public declaration, but in quiet certainty. The portrait, the diary, the flower, all of it had answered what no living person would say. She had learned that she was loved once, even briefly. That she had not been a mistake, but a consequence of longing, of choices denied permanence. That her life had not begun in shame, but had merely been wrapped in it by others. And perhaps that knowledge had been enough. Miss Marple often reflected on the peculiar grace of those who do not demand justice, only truth, who leave behind not accusations, but answers. The woman had died alone, yes, but not in despair. Her smile had been one of closure, a door quietly pulled shut on a room no longer haunted. The village would continue, the violets would bloom again, and the Grange, in time, might fade. But Miss Marple would remember her, not as a ghost or victim, but as a seeker, a woman who had walked into her story and allowed no one else to finish it for her. And with that, the truth was not only known, it was honored. Life, even when shaken by undercurrents of truth and tragedy, has a way of settling back into its familiar pattern, like water smoothing itself over a once disrupted pond. In fallow banks, the rhythm of routine resumed with such quietude that one might be forgiven for thinking the past weeks had been no more than an unsettled dream. The inn reopened, its window boxes refreshed with trailing ivy and late autumn cyclamen. Mrs. Hartnell resumed her weekly grumbles over misdirected post, and the Reverend Hayward delivered a sermon of gentle optimism that left the congregation thoughtful, but not agitated. Conversations, though more hushed than before, began to include the name no longer whispered, the woman. There was no need to call her anything more specific. Everyone understood. Her story had passed through them like wind through hedgerows, disturbing, revealing, then gone. Yet something had changed. Mr. Keene, once the outsider, now nodded at familiar faces with less formality. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one for apology, grew markedly quiet in social gatherings and was seen for the first time in memory, returning books to the church library without comment. Peter Latham returned to his roses. It was not denial that allowed the village to move forward, but acknowledgement. No great scandal had broken, no justice had been formally issued. But a woman long denied her name had found place enough to rest in their collective memory. And Miss Marple, knowing the fragile threads of community, understood that true restoration was not about forgetting, but about weaving the truth gently back into the fabric of daily life. It was the idea of young Mary Fawcett, aged 10 and newly appointed chair of the Junior Gardening Club, to clear the neglected beds of Hawthorne Grange. Her teacher had encouraged local history projects, and the grounds of the old house, half forgotten, choked with ivy, offered irresistible mystery. Permission was sought and granted without fuss. Soon children with trowels and watering cans swarmed the overgrown paths, laughing and planting with more enthusiasm than skill. Among the weeds and tangled roots, a new garden began to take shape. Miss Marple, walking past one morning, paused at the low wall and watched for a moment without speaking. A girl in a blue pinafore was gently placing a tray of young violets into freshly turned soil. They were of the native variety, small, modest, deeply purple. "Violets are for remembrance," the girl said unprompted. Miss Marple smiled, not at the sentiment but at the innocence of its delivery. The children knew nothing of the woman who had died by that same wall. They had no understanding of the generations that had come before, or of the sorrow long pressed into the soil. But they planted nonetheless, quietly, kindly, without knowing they were giving back what had once been taken. And in that simple act of renewal, the garden ceased to be a place of secrets. It became, instead, a place where something could bloom again. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had finally been seen. The matter of a grave had been delicately handled. Mr. Keene, with the restrained care of a man long accustomed to discretion, made the arrangements quietly, ensuring there was no public notice, no disruption to village life. The woman was buried just beyond the hedge that bordered the old cemetery, technically within its grounds, though not in consecrated soil. No surname was etched in stone, no claim made upon any family. Instead, a simple inscription had been chosen. On a flat gray tablet, unpolished and dignified, were engraved the words, "To she who returned, loved, lost, at peace." Beneath it, a small violet motif had been carved, not for ornament, but for truth. Miss Marple visited only once, placing a single bloom at its base. She had no need to visit again. The woman's presence, after all, was not in the grave. It remained in the smile she had worn at the end, and in the ripple she had left behind. The villagers, by unspoken agreement, allowed the site to remain undisturbed. No one questioned its existence. Some nodded as they passed. A few left flowers in spring. Children played near it, unaware of the story beneath their feet. But in that quiet corner, a kind of justice had settled, not of courts or judgments, but of human acknowledgement. And in Miss Marple's mind, that was the only kind that ever truly endured. Miss Marple's own garden, modest but meticulous, offered her a kind of daily philosophy. Among the thyme and primrose, she had always reserved a narrow bed for violets, neither showy nor perfumed, but enduring. This year they seemed to bloom with unusual vigor. As she trimmed a stem here, watered another there, she reflected not only on what had happened, but on what had endured. The village had absorbed the truth with a kind of stunned grace, not because it sought drama, but because, in the end, it understood decency. She thought of the woman, not her face, but her quiet persistence. A life lived outside a name, outside approval, yet returned with dignity and without bitterness. Grief, Miss Marple knew, often wore politeness like a veil, and truth, when finally spoken, did not shout. It settled, softly, like petals falling. She stood for a moment, secateurs in hand, looking at the small patch of violet beneath her window. Even the saddest hearts, given time and truth, may one day remember how to smile. And so, the mystery of the woman who never smiled is laid gently to rest, not with scandal or spectacle, but with quiet truth and long-awaited peace. In true Miss Marple fashion, it was not grand clues or dramatic confrontations that solved the puzzle, but the delicate threads of human nature. A forgotten diary page, a violet pressed by memory, a mirror holding more than just a reflection. This story reminds us that sometimes what a person seeks is not justice, but simply to be seen, to know where they come from, to understand that their existence, even if denied, once mattered to someone. The woman came in silence, and in silence she departed. But her journey stirred the hearts of many and healed wounds that had festered in secrecy for decades. Miss Marple, as always, taught us that truth has a way of blooming, even in the darkest corners of the past. But tell me, what would you have done if a stranger arrived in your village carrying nothing but a flower and a face from long ago? Would you have feared her presence or helped her uncover what was buried? Let us know in the comments. We truly love hearing your thoughts, and it helps more mystery lovers discover these stories too. If you enjoyed this tale and the elegant way Miss Marple always sees what others miss, do consider subscribing for more cozy mysteries, timeless twists, and thoughtful suspense. And don't forget to share this story with a friend who enjoys a bit of tea, a bit of truth, and just the right touch of tragedy. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and keep your eyes open, even for the quiet ones.